next. At one end of the corridor musicians sat in a green grove, and Walter, with some interest, turned toward these, but his sister, pressing his arm, impelled him in the opposite direction. "What's the matter now?" he asked. "That's Jazz Louie and his half-breed bunch. 3 white and 4 mulatto. Let's—" "No, no," she whispered. "We must speak to Mildred and Mr. and Mrs. Palmer." "Speak to 'em? I haven't got a thing to say to those berries." "Walter, won't you please behave?" He seemed to consent, for the moment at least, and suffered her to take him down the corridor toward a floral bower where the hostess stood with her father and mother. Other couples and groups were moving in the same direction, carrying with them a hubbub of laughter and fragmentary chatterings; and Alice, smiling all the time, greeted people on every side of her eagerly, a little more eagerly than most of them responded, while Walter nodded in a non-committal manner to one or two, said nothing, and yawned audibly, the last resource of a person who finds himself nervous in a false situation. He repeated his yawn and was beginning another when a convulsive pressure upon his arm made him understand that he must abandon this method of reassuring himself. They were close upon the floral bower. Mildred was giving her hand to one and another of her guests as rapidly as she could, passing them on to her father and mother, and at the same time resisting the efforts of 3 or 4 detached bachelors who besought her to give over her duty in favour of the dance music just beginning to blare. She was a large, fair girl with a kindness of eye somewhat withheld by an expression of fastidiousness. At first sight of her, it was clear that she would never in her life do anything incorrect or wear anything incorrect. But her correctness was of the finer sort, and had no air of being studied or achieved. Conduct would never offer her a problem to be settled from a book of rules, for the rules were so deep within her that she was unconscious of them. And behind this perfection there was an even ampler perfection of what Mrs. Adams called "background." The big, rich, simple house was part of it, and Mildred's father and mother were part of it. They stood beside her, large, serene people, murmuring graciously and gently inclining their handsome heads as they gave their hands to the guests; and even the youngest and most ebullient of these took on a hushed mannerliness with a closer approach to the bower. When the opportunity came for Alice and Walter to pass within this precinct, Alice, going first, leaned forward and whispered in Mildred's ear, "You didn't wear the maize georgette. That's what I thought you were going to. But you look simply darling! And those pearls!" Others were crowding decorously forward, anxious to be done with ceremony and get to the dancing; and Mildred did not prolong the intimacy of Alice's enthusiastic whispering. With a faint accession of colour, and a smile tending somewhat in the direction of rigidity, she carried Alice's hand immediately onward to Mrs. Palmer's. Alice's own colour showed a little heightening as she accepted the suggestion thus implied. Nor was that emotional tint in any wise decreased, a moment later, by an impression that Walter, in concluding the brief exchange of courtesies between himself and the stately Mr. Palmer, had again reassured himself with a yawn. But she did not speak of it to Walter. She preferred not to confirm the impression, and to leave in her mind a possible doubt that he had done it. He followed her out upon the waxed floor and said, resignedly, "Well, come on," put his arm around her, and they began to dance. Alice danced gracefully and well, but not so well as Walter. Of all the steps and runs, of all the whimsical turnings and twirlings, of all the rhythmic swayings and dips commanded that season by such blarings as were the barbaric product, loud and wild, of the Jazz Louies and their half-breed bunches, the thin and sallow youth was a master. Upon his face could be seen contempt of the easy marvels he performed, as he moved in swift precision from one smooth agility to another; and if some too dainty or jealous cavalier complained that to be so much a stylist in dancing was not quite like a gentleman, at least Walter's style was what the music called for. No other dancer in the room could be thought comparable to him. Alice told him so. "It's wonderful," she said. "And the mystery is where you ever learned to do it. You never went to dancing school, but there isn't a man in the room who can dance half so well. I don't see why, when you dance like this, you always make such a fuss about coming to parties." He sounded his brief laugh, a jeering bark out of one side of the mouth, and swung her miraculously through a closing space between 2 other couples. "You know a lot about what goes on, don't you? You probably think there is no other place to dance in this town except these frozen-face joints." "Frozen face?" she echoed, laughing. "Why, everybody's having a splendid time. Look at them." "Oh, they holler loud enough," he said. "They do it to make each other think they're having a good time. You don't call that Palmer family frozen-face berries, I suppose? No?" "Certainly not. They're just dignified and—" "Yeuh," said Walter. "They're dignified, especially when you tried to whisper to Mildred to show how in you were with her, and she moved you on that way. She's a hot friend, isn't she?" "She didn't mean anything by it. She—" "Ole Palmer's a hearty slap-you-on-the-back old berry," Walter interrupted, adding in a casual tone, "All I'd like to hit him." "Walter!" "By the way, you mustn't forget to ask Mildred for a dance before the evening is over." "Me?" He produced the lopsided appearance of his laugh, but without making it vocal. "You watch me do it." "She probably won't have one left, but you must ask her anyway." "Why must I?" "Because in the first place you're supposed to, and in the second place she's my most intimate friend." "Yeuh! Is she? I've heard you pull that most intimate friend stuff often enough about her. What's she ever do to show she is?" "Never mind. You really must ask her, Walter. I want you to, and I want you to ask several other girls afterwhile. I'll tell you who." "Keep on wanting. It'll do you good." "Oh, but you really—" "Listen," he said. "I'm just as liable to dance with any of these fairies as I am to buy a bucket of rusty tacks and eat 'em. Forget it! Soon as I get rid of you I'm going back to that room where I left my hat and overcoat and smoke myself to death." "Well," she said, a little ruefully, as the frenzy of Jazz Louie and his half-breeds was suddenly abated to silence, you mustn't get rid of me too soon, Walter." They stood near one of the wide doorways, remaining where they had stopped. Other couples everywhere joined one another, forming vivacious clusters, but none of these groups adopted the brother and sister, nor did any one appear to be hurrying in Alice's direction to ask her for the next dance. She looked about her, still maintaining that jubilance of look and manner she felt so necessary, for it is to the girls who are having a good time that partners are attracted; and in order to lend greater colour to her impersonation of a lively belle, she began to chatter loudly, bringing into play an accompaniment of frolicsome gesture. She brushed Walter's nose saucily with the bunch of violets in her hand, tapped him on the shoulder, shook her pretty forefinger in his face, flourished her arms, kept her shoulders moving, and laughed continuously as she spoke. "You naughty old Walter!" she cried. "Aren't you ashamed to be such a wonderful dancer and then only dance with your own little sister? You could dance on the stage if you wanted to. Why, you could make a fortune that way. Why don't you? Wouldn't it be just lovely to have all the rows and rows of people clapping their hands and shouting, 'Hurrah! Hurrah for Walter Adams! Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!'" He stood looking at her in stolid pity. "Cut it out," he said. "You'd better be giving some of these berries the eye so they'll ask you to dance." She was not to be so easily checked, and laughed loudly, flourishing her violets in his face again. "You would like it. You know you would. You needn't pretend. Just think, a whole big audience shouting, 'Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!'" "The place'll be pulled if you get any noisier," he interrupted, not ungently. "Besides, I'm no muley cow." "A cow!" she laughed. "What on earth—" "I can't eat dead violets," he explained, "so don't keep trying to make me do it." This had the effect he desired, and subdued her. She abandoned her unsisterly coquetries, and looked beamingly about her, but her smile was more mechanical than it had been at first. At home she had seemed beautiful, but here, where the other girls competed, things were not as they had been there, with only her mother and Miss Perry to give contrast. These crowds of other girls had all done their best also to look beautiful, though not one of them had worked so hard for such a consummation as Alice had. They did not need to. They did not need to get their mothers to make old dresses over. They did not need to hunt violets in the rain. At home her dress had seemed beautiful, but that was different too, where there were dozens of brilliant fabrics, fashioned in new ways, some of these new ways startling, which only made the wearers centres of interest and shocked no one. And Alice remembered that she had heard a girl say, not long before, "Oh, organdie! Nobody wears organdie for evening gowns except in midsummer." Alice had thought little of this, but as she looked about her and saw no organdie except her own, she found greater difficulty in keeping her smile as arch and spontaneous as she wished it. In fact, it was beginning to make her face ache a little. Mildred came in from the corridor, heavily attended. She carried a great bouquet of violets laced with lilies of the valley, and the violets were lusty big purple things, their stems wrapped in cloth of gold, with silken cords dependent, ending in long tassels. She and her convoy passed near the two young Adamses, and it appeared that one of the convoy besought his hostess to permit cutting in. They were doing it other places of late, he urged. But he was denied, and told to console himself by holding the bouquet, at intervals, until his third of the 16th dance should come. Alice looked dubiously